Hi everybody, my name is Yisrael Amirsky. I'm a cybersecurity researcher at Ben-Gurion University. And today I'm going to show you a tool that we developed for detecting man-in-the-middle attacks in LANs using echo analysis. This work was co-authored by Naor Kalbo, Asaf Shabtai, and Yuval Elovich. So let's begin. So why do we care about man-in-the-middle attacks in LANs? It sounds kind of archaic, but the truth is it's actually quite a bit of a threat. The reason is that they're easy to implement, most cases hard to detect, and still very useful tools for attackers. For example, they're a basic tool for performing reconnaissance. You see them being used in lateral movement in APTs, and they're very effective because so many systems are misconfigured. For example, offices, factories, and hospitals, and the list goes on. Let me tell you a bit of a story from one of the projects I've been working on recently. I had to perform a pen test on a hospital where I wanted to capture medical scans being sent from a CT scanner to manipulate them. Now, what I did was I came to the hospital at night when the cleaning staff opened the doors, and I went inside and the cleaning staff didn't mind at all that I was there. And I went and found one of the CT scanners, and I came and brought with me a small Raspberry Pi with 2 Ethernet ports. I attached an external adapter, and I plugged it in between the CT scanner and the rest of the network so that I could intercept all the traffic. Not only was I able to do this within 30 seconds, but I was also able to capture all the CT scans, which weren't encrypted, by the way, and within 3 minutes, get the credentials of about 27 doctors in the hospital. So this is just an example of why we still care about man-in-the-middle attacks in LANs. And LANs isn't just like one switch and a few hosts. You can actually have quite large LANs with multiple switches and hundreds of hosts. So let's talk about the different kinds of man-in-the-middle attacks that you can find in the LAN. The first kind is the classic kind where Eve is diverting traffic through her so that she can manipulate the packets or the content of the packets. So the most classic example of this or implementation of this is ARP spoofing, but there are many other techniques how this can be done. The second technique is called inline, or referred to as inline man-in-the-middle attack. Well, like you saw in the video, the attacker places a device right in line of the wire, and this is much harder to detect because the attacker doesn't have to leave any forensic evidence in the packets they manipulate. The last kind, which we refer to as in-point, is where the attacker actually goes to a switch in the network and replaces it with his or her own switch that has been tampered with so it can also perform manipulations on the traffic. And this is the hardest form of man-in-the-middle attack in the LAN to detect. So the current methods for detecting these man-in-the-middle attacks generally perform passive analysis. And this means that they look at the packets that are going over the networks to see if there's any evidence that there's a man-in-the-middle at play here. Now, the problem with doing passive analysis is that they don't generalize to different attacks, they're not portable, and they can generate false positives. So instead of doing passive sensing, actually what we'd like to do is perform active sensing. We'd like to send probes throughout the network and try to sense if there's any man-in-the-middle out there. How are we going to do that? So imagine if you could see like a bat. Think of a room filled with objects, a television, a carpet, pictures on the walls, and you clap your hands, and you listen to the echo. How does that sound? Now remove all the objects from that room and clap your hands again. What do you hear? The sound's different, right? That's because the sound waves reverberated off all the surfaces and the materials and the objects in the room and bounce back to you and capture what is in essence a fingerprint of that room. What I just referred to here is what is also called a linear time invariant system. And that clap is also referred to as a direct pulse. And that echo is referred to as an impulse response. And here are a few examples of impulse responses in acoustics for a small cave, a parking garage, a large room, and a church. You can see that each of these impulse responses are unique to those rooms. And as a matter of fact, if you would even alter one thing in that room, you can pick that up in the impulse response. The reverberations will change and the fingerprint will change. Now, the problem with using a direct pulse is it's not so good in populated environments. And also, it can be spoofed. So what we're actually going to use is something called a maximum length sequence signal, where we send this kind of noisy signal, as you can see, which is based off a random, pseudo-random binary sequence generated by this feedback loop. And what's special about this MLS sequence, aside from all sorts of acoustic properties that we can actually capture the impulse response, is that it works well in populated environments, and it's much harder to spoof because every time we send out this pulse, we can make it a new random signal. Now, the only difference between using this and a direct pulse is that we have to perform deconvolution on the echo to get out the impulse response, but don't worry about all the math. I'm going to leave that out. You can trust me. Okay, so how do we apply this to a LAN? So Alice wants to protect her link with Bob. So what she's going to do is she's going to probe that link by sending an intense burst of pings, ICMP echo requests, where each ping in that burst is going to be modulated according to the MLS sequence. So if there's a 1 in that sequence, she's going to send a ping with a maximum payload size of 1,500 bytes. And if there is a 0 in that sequence, she's going to send a ping with a payload size of 0. When Bob receives that signal, he's going to automatically reply as you would in a ping. And what Eve is going to do is she's going to measure the round trip times for each of those pings. And as you can see, the echo that Alice gets back reflects the original signal being sent, which makes sense, as you would imagine, as you would expect from an echo. But it's not the same as just taking the round trip times over the network, because all the hardware and certain physical defects in the system and algorithms and software of all the switches and components, including Bob along the way, apply a dynamic effect on the echo that we receive. For example, here's an impulse response for 2 identical switches, blue and red, where you can see they are distinctly different. And the reason is because during the manufacturing process of these switches, certain defects find their way into the chips and causes slight changes in the way, for example, the clock skew looks like. And this also affects how the response of these packets will be processed. And we can pick that up, and we can differentiate between these devices. So if Alice continues probing this link, she can get a nice profile of how the link between Alice and Bob should look like. So that if Eve should ever come along, that profile and will be a clear indicator that something has changed in the network and that Eve is being now tampering and eavesdropping on the traffic. So with this approach, we can actually detect every kind of man-in-the-middle attack in LANs, and the main reason for that is because, by definition, a man-in-the-middle has to first take a look at the packet to determine if he wants to manipulate it, and only afterwards he can then decide to manipulate it or not. But the fact that he's already taken that packet and started to read it means that he's processing it with his electronics, with his software, and that's going to leave his fingerprint on the burst of packets that we're sending through the network. So that means for traffic diversion, such as ARP poisoning, inline man-in-the-middle attacks, such as network bridges, or in-point man-in-the-middle attacks, all of these we can detect. But of course, I have to point out that we're not talking about passive wiretaps, where somebody connects directly onto the copper and is just listening to the electronic signal, because this isn't a man-in-the-middle attack. There's no actual intervention happening. So let's talk about the tool that we developed, we call Vesper. Vesper breaks down into 3 components: the link prober, the feature extractor, and the host profiler. First, we select an IP address somewhere inside our LAN, and we generate a random MLS sequence, and we send an intense burst of these ping requests to our host. In parallel, we also receive those responses, and we extract 3 vectors: X being the MLS sequence that we generated, Y being the round trip times, and Z being the jitter, the timing between the packets. From these 3 vectors, we summarize the entire probe into 3 values. The first value is the average energy of the impulse response. The second value is the average round trip time of the largest packets in that burst. And the third value is the probability of that jitter distribution fitting previous probes that we've sent. Now, once we have the summary of this probe, we just look up a profile that we've made for this IP address. Using any classic anomaly detection algorithm, we can determine whether this point, these 3 values, match all the other probes that we've taken for this IP address before. Now, there are many different anomaly detection algorithms you can use. The one which we actually deployed and published in this tool is referred to as local outlier factor. And I'll just give you a very high-level explanation how this works. So each point here, for example, let's say is a probe that I've made when I was trying to sample and trying to understand how this link looks like, or what this link looks like. And the x and y axes are showing the first and second features. The third feature I left out for simplicity. When a new probe is made, it falls out somewhere among these points. And I take a look at the neighbors to understand if it's an outlier or not. Outlier meaning it's far away from all the other points, so it's an anomaly. Inlier meaning it's close to all the other points, within all the other points, and therefore it's normal. But it's sometimes not enough just to look at the neighbors. We have to actually kind of measure what the density is around the other points to understand the context. So for example, in this case, this is an inlier, but if another probe is made and we see it's way off in respect to the densities of all the other probes around us, then we know that this is an outlier. You can go check up on how this is actually computed, but I'm going to leave it out to keep it nice and simple. All right, so let's talk a bit about the evaluation. So we took a look at three different kinds of man-in-the-middle attacks in LANs. And the first kind for endpoint man-in-the-middle attacks we implemented ARP poisoning. For inline, we took a look at a network bridge implemented by a Raspberry Pi and a network bridge implemented by a regular 1 gigabit per second Ethernet switch. And for the endpoint, we tried different switches, and we also tried identical switches, see if we can determine if somebody swaps on an identical switch with another identical switch. And now it's also important to note that we have to consider any traffic going over the network that may mess up our probes. So we tested our techniques in many different environments. One environment being a surveillance network with 7 switches and 13 network hosts. The other being a server network with 3 switches and 61 servers, and a large office network with 14 switches and over 300 network hosts with multiple VLANs and optical uplinks. So for the case of sending probes over one hop, i.e. one intermediary switch, we were able to detect the different man-in-the-middle attack, traffic diversion man-in-the-middle attack quite easily in the different scenarios, and same with the network bridge cases. And we're also able to detect when a switch was swapped out with a different model. And not only that, but we're also able to detect when the switch was swapped out with the identical model, and in some cases, we're able to detect when a port was changed. So if somebody swaps from one port to another, just by the way the hardware has been constructed and all those defects I mentioned prior. This is the case of the port swapping doesn't always work, but in most cases we found that changing a switch with another switch does work in terms of detection. Now for multiple intermediary switches, we actually tried attacking our secretary, and we were able to detect the attacks during the day and the night. So it doesn't matter how much traffic was going over the network, we were still able to determine that there was a man-in-the-middle in play. And of course, we also tried for the long haul over an entire week of regular traffic in our environment, and we were still able to detect the attacks as well. However, in order to limit the number of false positives, we had to apply an averaging window of about 15 seconds. And you could always adjust this in the tool that we've published. You can, a larger averaging window will lower the false alarm rate, but it would also increase the detection delay, so you have to consider the trade-off there. So we're at Black Hat, and we also have to consider the possibility that somebody's going to attack our tool, right? So let's talk about how an adversary can mess with us. So there are 4 different ways an adversary, Eve, can try and bypass or evade our detection. The first kind is a naive approach, is just simply let's drop all the ICMP requests I see being sent. And that's very easy to detect because obviously I won't see a signal from Bob. The second approach is spoofing. And in spoofing, Eve will respond on behalf of Bob, but what will happen here is that now the impulse response will capture the fingerprint of Eve and not of Bob, so we'll be able to detect that. The third approach is to perform a replay attack where Eve has a pre-recorded probe and she just replays that probe whenever she sees me probing. And the problem with that is that Eve will leave her fingerprint on top of that impulse response again. But not only that, our MLS sequence is different every single time we change it. And lastly, if Eve decides that she really wants to bypass us, she can develop her own dedicated hardware specifically designed to bypass our probes, which what it will do is every single time it sees an ICMP request, it'll assume that maybe there's a whole burst of ICMP requests going to happen right afterwards. So it'll immediately switch over to connecting copper to copper so that we won't be able to detect her. But even in this case, she still needs to see that first packet, which will cause some sort of delay and possibly corrupt the second packet after that, so we'll be able to detect her in most cases. Now, I mentioned we extracted 3 features. Why not just 1 feature from every probe? And the reason being is that every feature is strong against detecting one kind of adversarial attack against Vesper, but weak against others. So altogether, they provide a nice strong coverage for protecting at Vesper against these kinds of attacks. So let's look at some of these results. So for replay, there was no problem in detecting the attack because of the MLS sequence. Bypass, in most cases, we're able to detect it. And for spoofing, we actually took a look at hundreds of different devices, of different operating systems and hardware. And we also tried differentiating between identical devices. We took 48 Raspberry Pis, and we tried to see if we could differentiate between them, see if they each have a different fingerprint. And it turns out for the assorted devices, we almost instantly were able to determine that there was a spoof attack happening. And for the Raspberry Pis, after about 5 minutes of probing, we were able to differentiate between about 75% of them. So if anybody wants to download our tool, please go ahead and visit GitHub. There I put up a light version of Vesper, or Vesper version 1.0. This version has been implemented in Python with a C++ Cython wrapper because we need to be able to send the packets at a very high and rapid rate and also use nanosecond precision timing. So we wanted all the actual process of the probing to happen low level, but everything else is all implemented in Python, so you can take a look at it, see how it's implemented, and get an understanding what we're doing there. And the tool will let you monitor multiple IPs and also plot the anomaly scores for these IPs over time. And currently it's only implemented for Linux, but I do plan to port it also for Windows as well. It's a light version because it hasn't been tuned for, for every single kind of device. And the reason is because the sender sometimes has these certain qualities in terms of the performance of how well it can time, the precision and resolution. So although pretty much every device that we tested it on, you can detect all these man-in-the-middle attacks, for the extreme cases for, let's say, swapping out a switch with an identical switch where you need really, really high precision timing, in those cases you need to fine-tune the parameters of our algorithm to get it just so. So the light version, you won't be able to detect identical switches. You probably will be able to detect the case of a switch being swapped out with a different switch. And in the light version, we won't be prompting in any case of a detected adversarial attack. In terms of deployment, there are 2 ways you can deploy Vesper. The classic case, just put Vesper on an end host and have it probe every single IP address in your range inside your LAN. And the second case is where you put Vesper on your router, and in this case, Vesper will be able to protect any outbound internet traffic. If you think of the internet cafe scenario where some local man-in-the-middle is trying to intercept the internet traffic before it goes outbound and vice versa. In terms of train time, we found it takes about 1 minute of probing, sending 1 probe per second, but you can always adjust this to increase the probe rate or decrease the probe rate accordingly. So in summary, in a LAN, we can detect a man-in-the-middle by bouncing virtual signals off hosts. The approach detects all LAN-based man-in-the-middle attacks regardless of the forensic evidence or the attack implementation, whether it be ARP spoofing, DNS spoofing, a network bridge, and so on. And it's portable. Since it's implemented in the software level, you can port it to pretty much any system. And it's robust to adversarial attacks. If anybody wants to see a little bit deeper in how all the math behind this and how this all works, you can please take a look at our white paper. which should be also up on the Black Hat's webpage. And please visit our GitHub page as well. Thank you. Anybody have questions? Yeah.
How sensitive are like Alice and Bob to CPU? Like if the CPU load changes, wouldn't the profile sort of change as like the auto replier?
Yeah. So the question was how sensitive Alice and Bob is to CPU load. So for example, if Alice is running different applications at different times, or Bob is, let's say, a server that has different loads at different hours of the day, how does it affect the response? So that's a very good question. And actually, what we found is that it's not so effective. It doesn't change the response so much. For example, when we tested in the server network, I'm not going to go back to the slide, but you saw there sometimes there's noise, right? Sometimes there are probes where fall out as anomalies by accident, false alarms, and most of the times it's fine. And that's because of those loads. So what we do is we perform an averaging window over, let's say, a few probes, 5 probes, 6 probes, which is like a few seconds, to get an average kind of a consensus of is there actually an anomaly here or not, and that basically mitigates that issue. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.